Good morning. Welcome to the Cato Institute's web event on marijuana and federalism. My name is Trevor Burris. I'm a research fellow at the Cato Institute and editor-in-chief of the Cato Supreme Court Review. Now, of course, in this time of crisis, there's a lot of understandable discussion about the current pandemic and coronavirus, but of course, there are other issues going on, and the issue of marijuana and its relationship between the federal and state governments is one that is ongoing. It also, of course, has to do with federalism, which relates to some of the current pandemic and public health. And today we'll be discussing with the editor and one of the contributors of this book, Marijuana Federalism, which has been published by the Brookings Institution, Uncle Sam and Mary Jane. Joining me is the editor-in-chief, Jonathan Adler. He is the Johann Vorheim Memorial Professor of Law at the Case Western Reserve University School of Law, and John Hudak, Deputy Director of the Center for Effective Public Management and a Senior Fellow in Governance Studies at the Brookings Institution. Also commenting is Ilya Shapiro, Director of the Cato Institute's Robert A. Levy Center for Constitutional Studies. Welcome, gentlemen. Getting us started, I thought we'd go to the editor of the book, Jonathan Adler, and talk about sort of what's happened, what we've seen happening in marijuana and federalism since the big moment when my home state and Washington legalized marijuana in 2012, and even before.
Sure. Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm sorry we can't do this in person, but glad to be able to be here and talk about marijuana federalism, both the book and the underlying issues that led to us wanting to do this book. Basically, over the last few decades, we've seen dramatic changes in the legal landscape relating to marijuana, and this has occurred within the context of our federal system. And as much as any issue, it's illustrated both some of the benefits of a decentralized federalist system, but also some of the problems that can arise when state governments and the federal government don't cooperate and don't work together. 25 years ago, marijuana was illegal throughout the United States. And beginning in the 1990s, though, some states initially began to legalize marijuana for medicinal purposes, California being among the first to do that. And then, as Trevor noted, in 2012, Colorado and Washington State became the first states to withdraw fully from the federal war against marijuana and legalized it not merely for medicinal purposes, but also for recreational purposes. Since then, another 9 states and the District of Columbia have followed Colorado and Washington State's lead in legalizing marijuana for recreational use. You have another 20-some states that allow fairly broad medicinal use of marijuana. You've had states reform their laws with regard to certain cannabis derivative products, CBD oils and the like. You've had some additional states reduce penalties for low-level marijuana possession. And this has all occurred against the backdrop of maintaining federal prohibition of marijuana. And so we're seeing two things going on simultaneously. On the one hand, we're seeing a great experiment in different states adopting different policies. And that's generating a lot of information about the pros and cons of marijuana legalization. And we have a chapter in the book that looks at the preliminary data, and it's obviously still preliminary in terms of what the consequences of marijuana legalization are. Does it affect various health outcomes? Does it affect problems of kids in school? What does it do to youth use and youth access? What does it do to alcohol use and so on? What does it do to crime? So we're seeing this great experiment that's teaching us a lot, not merely about whether or not regulating or prohibiting marijuana is a good or bad idea, but also we're beginning to learn something about how relatively small differences in state laws can actually make a difference in terms of the practical on-the-ground consequences. I think overall, thus far, the effects have been less than a lot of people predicted. Legalizing marijuana has not produced nirvana. It has not produced a chaos either, but it has certainly had some effects. But because marijuana remains illegal under federal law, these experiments are somewhat distorted. That the federal government's continuing prohibition of marijuana use, cultivation, possession, distribution, has effects on what occurs at the state level, and creates some problems. We all know, this being the Cato Institute, we don't have to remind folks that our federal government is one of limited and enumerated powers. But the Supreme Court has held that the Commerce Clause, supplemented by the Necessary and Proper Clause, can reach even the local intrastate use and possession of marijuana. But despite that holding, the reality is the federal government doesn't have the resources, doesn't have the will to try and be the cop on the street. And so we have the situation where a lot of activity is occurring at the state level that's technically illegal under federal law, but it's for most people, they don't actually have to fear criminal enforcement. And some of the things that the book goes into, which we can talk about in some more detail, is that the federal prohibition doesn't affect whether or not an individual is worried about having a small amount of marijuana in their pocket, but it does affect the ability of a business to obtain financial services and banking services. It does affect what a business can deduct on their tax returns. It affects the way lawyers approach providing legal services to marijuana businesses. It can expose businesses to civil RICO exposure. So the fact that we have this differential treatment between state and federal law matters. And even folks like Attorney General Bill Barr, who are not in favor of marijuana legalization, recognize that the status quo isn't stable, and that if we're going to allow marijuana federalism, we do ultimately need to make some changes in federal law. And as an initial matter, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jonathan. Before we go on to John, I wanted to point out that we'll be taking questions online on all the platforms that we're streaming, and the hashtag for this event is Cato SCOTUS, Cato SCOTUS. And with that, we'll go to John Hudak from Brookings.
Thanks, Trevor. Thanks, Jonathan, for editing this volume and obviously contributing some great content to it. It was my pleasure to work on it, and thank you to all the viewers out there watching us from home and being able and willing to participate today. A lot of what Jonathan said about these changes in cannabis policy over the past couple of decades has happened in large part because of rapid changes in public opinion. Cannabis policy, cannabis as a topic in itself, is pretty fascinating in terms of just how rapid public opinion has changed, how much it's diversified, at first being largely in favor of medical cannabis, and then eventually becoming nationwide in favor of adult use cannabis. And that has really motivated the policy changes that we've seen. So we see that change in public opinion happening in polling. We're also seeing it happening through ballot initiatives that are passing, first in states like Colorado and Washington, but then states on the West Coast, the East Coast, as far north as Alaska. And we're seeing changes also happening in public opinion that's motivating legislatures to act. Vermont being the first to pass some form of a cannabis legalization bill a couple of years ago, and then last year, Illinois becoming the first state to pass a full-scale commercialized adult use cannabis bill through its legislature, a campaign promise that newly elected Governor Pritzker had made. Those changes are meaningful. Those changes are pushing public policy in a very clear direction. But the interesting thing about public opinion around cannabis is that while support for that issue is extraordinarily high, the issue's salience is not. So if you ask someone, do you support cannabis legalization? Most chances are they're going to say yes. If you ask them, is cannabis legalization in your top 20 issues? Or what are the top 20 most important issues to you? Most people are not going to put cannabis legalization in that top 20. And so that creates these interesting dynamics where people are really supportive of an issue that they really don't care much about. But therein lies an interesting rub, and that is that even though the issue isn't salient, as Jonathan had said, it touches on so many different areas of public policy that I think people who don't look at this all the time think of cannabis as a pretty simplistic yes, no, buy it or arrest for it kind of issue. But it touches on agriculture, the environment, energy, real estate, tax, banking, a whole variety of issues, even beyond that list, that when people start to think about it, they realize that cannabis policy touches their lives sometimes in very indirect ways, and ends up having a role in much broader public policy debates. And we're seeing that right now in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, and that is a real lack of preparedness at the state level for what to do with this nascent industry in the case of a state level, or in this case, national level crisis. You're seeing governors respond, and governors are responding in two ways. The first, I think, is sort of flying by the seat of their pants. They weren't prepared for this, particularly in the context of cannabis policy, and they're trying to get it right on the fly. But the second is that governors are responding to the COVID-19 pandemic in the context of cannabis policy in a way that reflects public opinion. Most governors are keeping cannabis dispensaries open in legal states. The one exception is Charlie Baker in Massachusetts, who is probably one of the few governors in America who is more popular than cannabis legalization. And they are recognizing the details of access, of people's view that this is medicine and the need for that, particularly in a period of anxiety and other health crises. But it's also doing something else that this book touches on, and I think it's why this book is so valuable, in addition to it showing how many different aspects of policy it touches on. And that is, this pandemic is telling people that they need to think about federalism. Seeing a president and governors battle it out over who has authority is an interesting dynamic that we see every day in cannabis policy. Most Americans, maybe they know a little bit about federalism, but federalism isn't something they think about every day. But cannabis is something rooted deeply in federalism, and it's something I think more Americans are going to be paying attention to.
Thank you, John. We'll move it over to Ilya with some remarks before we kind of get the Q&A going.
Well, I'd like to first thank John Adler for putting this together, and Brookings for publishing the book. John and Jonathan didn't talk that much about the book, but it really is a remarkable contribution to this issue. Now, it's called Marijuana Federalism. The subtitle is quite clever: Uncle Sam and Mary Jane, right? Get it? Well, with respect to marijuana federalism, I'm in it for the federalism. I like to think of myself as an objective commentator in this area because I've never partaken in the particular weed in any of its forms. Ironically, Randy Barnett, professor at Georgetown, who argued Raich versus Gonzalez, the important case where the Supreme Court 15 years ago ruled that Congress, the federal government, can indeed regulate even local state-complying growth and consumption of cannabis. He also has not consumed. But anyway, I think it's a fascinating topic. It's a fascinating book because John Hudak was talking about the different areas of law and policy that cannabis touches on. Well, this book as well. This is not just kind of hoity-toity constitutional theory. It talks about banking and finance with regard to marijuana businesses. It talks about legal advice and bar regulation. It talks about polling that John Hudak's chapter on public policy. It talks about the social science results that we're seeing, whether in crime or suicide rates, health care, all these different aspects. What has the Supreme Court said? A recent decision striking down a federal law that prevented states from legalizing sports gambling, Murphy versus NCAA. What does that opinion have to do with this regulatory tension? So it's really a great and accessible, fairly thin book that builds on and updates and makes more accessible a very good symposium that Case Western's Law Review put together that John Adler was also instrumental in 2015. So if you want a kind of a deeper dive and a more kind of technical legalistic dive into that, I recommend that to you. It's now 5 years old, so we have more results, more legalization and what have you. But anyway, very good book, very good summary of all these different areas. The fundamental thing about this area of policy is, how can we even be talking about marijuana legalization? Because after all, there's the supremacy clause in the Constitution, which says that when a state and federal law conflict, the federal law trumps. The federal law governs. It's supreme. That's the way our Constitution works. Well, there's two caveats to that. First of all, there has to be proper federal authority or jurisdiction over the law in question. Here, the Supreme Court, I think, in my view, incorrectly decided Raich versus Gonzalez. For now, we're stuck with federal regulation of even local, intrastate, non-commercial aspects of marijuana. But regardless, the second part is that even in those areas where Congress is properly legislating and regulating, it cannot force states to enforce federal law. In the technical term, it cannot commandeer state officials, whether those be legislators to criminalize marijuana or law enforcement to enforce federal law. And because of the practical challenges of enforcing the Federal Controlled Substances Act, that is that there are only 4,000 DEA agents worldwide. Most law enforcement in this country is done by state and local officers. 99% of marijuana arrests or cases are generated by state and local officers. It's for practical purposes, the federal government can't pursue its law in the same way everywhere if local officials are not cooperating. And that makes it kind of the situation where we have Schrodinger's weed that's both legal and illegal at the same time. And what we're seeing is that cannabis legalization or experimentation in public policy has survived and thrived in the shadow of the federal ban. And we're seeing that this is just one example of a phenomenon, this tension, federalism tension, whether cooperation or conflict, or in any event coexistence, that we're seeing in different areas of policy, from immigration with sanctuary cities and other aspects, gun control, Obamacare, gambling, and coronavirus, the COVID-19 tension that everyone's speaking about. So fascinating area of law, good book, good primer on these different areas. And you can really teach I don't know if any schools yet have an entire course on marijuana law, but you can get at a lot of different aspects of legal domains through this prism.
Thank you, Ilya. Now, before I'm going to shoot it over for the questions, again, the hashtag is Cato SCOTUS for questions that I'll be taking. I'd like to take the moderator's privilege and ask this question. I'll go to Jonathan, and Ilya might have something to say, and maybe John. How does this compare to alcohol prohibition before the federal prohibition of alcohol in the 18th Amendment? So we had to pass a constitutional amendment to prohibit alcohol, but we prohibit drugs by statute, which seems kind of strange. And as you said, we have this Schrodinger situation where marijuana is simultaneously legal and illegal in the states where it's been legalized, which seems like someone might have screwed up somewhere if that's the case. So how does this relate to that? And then before alcohol prohibition, how did they deal with different states that had prohibition versus different states that didn't have prohibition?
Well, so there's a lot there, and yeah, I mean there's a lot there, and without going through the whole history of the evolution of constitutional doctrine, I mean the short answer is that prior to prohibition, the Commerce Clause was understood as the Interstate Commerce Clause. It grants Congress the power to regulate commerce among the several states, and so the idea that the federal government could regulate, let alone prohibit, the possession, the intrastate possession and sale of products was something that was, beyond the imagination of federal legislators. If you look in the progressive era at early federal laws governing food and drugs, like the beginnings of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act and the like, the idea is that until things were actually part of truly interstate commerce, the federal government had nothing to do with that. Now, after prohibition, what the federal government did is it made it a federal crime for an individual to import, export, or prepare to import or export or possess alcohol in violation of applicable state law. So what happened after prohibition was the federal government's approach to alcohol was, we are essentially a backstop. We are preventing people from taking advantage of a state where alcohol is legal as a way, as kind of a staging ground to sell and distribute alcohol where it's illegal, and recognizing the federal government has a comparative advantage, has some resources that states do not have to deal with things like interstate trafficking. And so to this day, it is a violation of federal law to violate state laws about distribution and importing and exporting of alcohol. And that allows states to adopt different rules. Now, alcohol is legal in every state, but different states have different rules about distribution, who can sell, and so on. And the federal government is basically in a supporting role, which is in line with the resource constraints that Ilya just talked about. In the sense, the federal government can play a useful role in helping deal with the interstate trafficking aspect of things. There's really not much the federal government can do in terms of the person walking down the street with marijuana in their pocket, or the corner marijuana dispensary. That said, I just think it's worth remembering, though, that this Schrodinger's weed dynamic is such that, as a practical matter, if I went to Colorado and I went to a marijuana dispensary and I purchased some marijuana for myself, the likelihood of anything happening to me under federal law is close to zero. But if the owner of that dispensary wants banking services, they have to deal with the fact that banks have to certify that they're not providing financial services for illegal activities. When an individual has a medical marijuana card, that still disqualifies them from purchasing a gun under federal law. If that marijuana dispensary creates problems for its neighbors, it's subject to civil RICO liability because the federal law violations are RICO predicate offenses. That dispensary can't expense the costs of their growing equipment, even though the neighboring business that's growing hydroponic tomatoes can expense that equipment. So, I mean, the fact that we don't have federal enforcement doesn't mean that we have this weird landscape where I can obtain marijuana without consequence in a state where it's legal, but doing so can affect things like my ability to own a gun. And that's a really, odd, and I would argue unstable status quo.
One other point on that, you asked about the prohibition example. One thing we can actually learn is that there, as in many areas, federal action, congressional, or in that case, a constitutional amendment, is a lagging indicator. So a lot of states had already prohibited alcohol in their states, or put in various restrictions of various kinds. So we had the situation that we do now with marijuana, where the same product is legal in some states and illegal in others. And it's not like that system was necessarily breaking down, but it came to the point where this, the origin of the phrase Baptist and bootlegger coalition came together, different interests, moral and economic, to outlaw nationwide. But there are examples, both in terms of the financial sector and criminal enforcement, that we can look at in that pre-prohibition period about how this can work without federal over-regulation.
Thank you. I'm going to go to our question feed now. We're getting a lot of questions coming in. Again, remember, it's Cato SCOTUS is the hashtag. We're taking questions on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. I'm going to start. There's two questions, one from Anonymous and another one from David White on Twitter, which both asked, to what extent do you expect increasing budgetary pressure due to the COVID-19 pandemic to accelerate legalization in some states? Do you see this being the trying to find money via selling? So maybe I'll kick this over. I don't know if John Hudak would have any comment on this, or whoever wants to weigh in.
Sure. So in a lot of states, governors and advocates are really starting to steer away from the revenue stream as a basis or as a reason for legalization, in large part because in the examples we have already, in the states that have legalized already, yes, states are making significant sums of tax revenue off of cannabis sales, but relative to a state budget, these are very small amounts of money. And so the fear, particularly among elected officials and advocates, is that if we promise cannabis legalization to be the path to end all of our budget woes, the public is ultimately going to be very disappointed when they see what those receipts look like. And so while yes, state and local budgets are going to be under tremendous strain in the coming year to 2 years because of COVID-19, and particularly because of the interruption in economic activity, I don't really see governors in particular and others focusing on this as a big solution. Now, it can be packaged as part of a broader solution to say, listen, we need to jumpstart the economy. We need to jumpstart tax revenue in this state. Let's include cannabis in part of that conversation. But I think if advocates and state legislators and others try to overplay their hand and make this seem like it will be the cure-all, it would be a political mistake and a strategic error on their behalf.
And if
Thank
I
you.
just jump in on that. I mean,
John.
can I jump in on that, Trevor? Yeah, I think John's point about politicians being concerned about overpromising is an important one. I mean, the chapter in the book that looks at the empirical social science data shows that both advocates of legalization and opponents of legalization both exaggerated their what the effects would be. They both made claims about the effects that were greater than what we've actually seen. So the negative consequences on things like school discipline and crime and so on, much less than opponents predicted. But the benefits that people suggested were less than people predicted. If you look at the state of Washington, their state budget is somewhere in the neighborhood of $40 billion a year, I believe. They're bringing in right now, I think, just under $400 million of tax revenue from marijuana a year. So, that $400 million, that's decent amount of money. But if it's 1% of your state budget, that's not some massive cure to other budgetary shortfalls. It's useful money to have, but it's not, it's not a game changer.
Ilya, did you have a question?
Yeah, somewhat related to what we were just saying, but picking up on a few things. John Hudak's chapter in this book goes into public opinion polling, and it really is quite remarkable the shift in public opinion just in very recent times. I think it's the greatest change in American public opinion in such a short amount of time on any issue in our history, except same-sex marriage. I think that's the only one where there's been a more rapid shift. And you can see that in every state, in every demographic, the slope is kind of the same. And so I wonder with John, what, given that Congress is a lagging indicator on a lot of things, and certainly on this, when can we expect some sort of federal reform of federal law, given that the dynamic that you displayed? It's the opinion is one way, but it's low salience. So how do you think that's going to work? Is there a magical tipping point where, once there's enough states that have legalized recreationally, or once all the states have done it medically, where there's going to be a certain shift, as also congressmen get younger and younger, and there's a generational shift there?
Yeah, I don't buy into the tipping point theory. I think if there was a tipping point with this, we would have already seen Congress legalize medical cannabis. I think we're by any measure at that, beyond that tipping point. And so I don't think that that's really what's at play. In terms of trying to figure out a time when this is going to happen, I got out of the prediction business in November of 2016, so I'm not going to say that. But what I will say is that there is a lot of movement we're seeing in Congress right now. Last year, Congress passed the Safe Banking Act, which was the first pro-cannabis reform standalone piece of legislation passed by a chamber of Congress in American history. That's a significant step forward. We're seeing committee hearings on a variety of bills, both in the House and in the Senate. That is real progress, and that's the type of progress we see on any legislative issue, that is moving fairly rapidly in the direction of reform. I think the last point you made, Ilya, is an important one, and that is the changing demographics within Congress. A state legalizing, particularly for adult use, we see has a pretty significant effect on the rhetoric that members of Congress and particularly senators have with regard to the issue. But I do think as baby boomers, particularly people in the silent generation, exit Congress, typically because they die, and millennials begin to increase their numbers in Congress, we know that what's happening in the electorate is also going to be happening in the Congress, and it's not going to take that long. But ultimately, what you need, the right recipe for real reform in the United States Congress right now, rests first at the feet of the Senate Majority Leader. You need a different Senate Majority Leader for something that's cannabis related and not related to hemp to pass. And I think once that happens, there's going to be a gate opening that's going to allow a little bit more change.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions coming in that deal with banking. One from Victor Fox on Facebook, which discusses, which he asks about the chances of the Safe Banking Act passing, which, of course, now with the pandemic is probably very little. But maybe Jonathan or one of you want to comment on what's happening in the banking world and what are some of the fixes that have been proposed and their likelihood of passing.
Sure. So, I mean, I think one of the things that this, just to also to add on to John's last answer, is that, there are particular constituencies that don't really care about marijuana, but do care about being able to go about their business without interference. And, right, so gun owners learning that a medical marijuana card is going to ding them from purchasing a gun. That's something that suddenly may change people's view of things. The banking industry. The banking industry wants to be able to provide financial services to legal businesses, and having to worry about businesses being legal in some jurisdictions and not others is a headache for them. And as we learned during the Obama administration, there's really nothing that the executive branch can do about that. So the Obama administration did issue a memo trying to alleviate the concerns that the banking industry had, and they couldn't really do anything about the underlying legal requirements and what banks are required to certify. And Julie Hill of the University of Alabama has a chapter in the book that focuses on this. I think that the drive for reform in Congress probably comes from the concern that the financial sector has, because this current status quo is really unstable for them and complicates business for them. And so I think then the question becomes, do you get standalone banking legislation like the Safe Banking Act, or do you get something like the legislation that's proposed by Senator Cory Gardner and Senator Elizabeth Warren, a combination you wouldn't normally expect, that tries to actually follow the end of alcohol prohibition model, and basically says, look, it's not going to be illegal for purposes of federal law if what you are doing is fully compliant with applicable state law. You do that solves the banking problem. It also solves the other problems. But I think, back to the question, I do think that the federal prohibition pinching on particular interest groups that have independent concerns, like the financial sector, is the sort of thing that's likely to drive reform at the federal level, because the financial sector cares about this and it matters to them.
John?
I think that the COVID-19 pandemic really put the brakes on all kinds of legislation pending before Congress that is obviously not directly related to this. And so in that sense, it's really difficult for seeing the Safe Banking Act moving forward before the end of the Congress, particularly given that it's an election year, particularly given the social distancing requirements that are really keeping Congress away from doing business except that which is absolutely necessary. But I will say one of the things that I've been doing a little bit of writing about that I'm hoping to put some stuff out on soon is how is the pandemic going to affect the nature of the cannabis industry? I think, you see a lot of businesses still open in most states, but I think the economic effects of this are going to lead to business closures, business consolidation. And I think when we come out on the other end, the cannabis industry is going to look quite a bit different. And I think the negative economic effects that might happen to the industry as a result of this could end up applying pressure to Congress, the next Congress, to take up the banking bill as a means of relief. You're seeing right now problems with the cannabis industry trying to get access to the CARES Act in terms of the economic relief for small businesses, small business loans for employees, et cetera. That's challenging. And while their inclusion in future pieces of legislation related to the economic recovery is in question right now, I think that a broader conversation about the vulnerability of this industry and ways that it could be helped to stabilize through economic challenges, whether they are sort of historic global challenges like this, or maybe future challenges that are very unique to the industry itself, I think might boost the Safe Banking Act as part of that conversation moving forward.
Thank you. We have a couple questions from some anonymous people asking both who might be better in terms of incoming administration for marijuana federalism, President Trump or Joe Biden. And similar to that, is it possible, Mitch Nemeth on Twitter asks whether or not it's any reason to believe that a president could legalize cannabis on his or her first day without Congress's approval? And I guess more broadly, what things can presidents do about this? We start with Jonathan, I think.
Yeah, I'll start, and I know John might want to chime in and talk a little bit about the descheduling process. The reality is that there's very little that a president can do unilaterally in terms of the actual legal status of marijuana that quickly. The president could certainly encourage a reconsideration of marijuana being scheduled as a controlled substance, and John may want to talk about that. But we saw in the Obama administration the limits of what the executive branch could do. We had the Ogden and Cole memoranda, which instructed U.S. attorneys not to pursue marijuana prosecutions for cases that did not involve interstate trafficking and did not involve distribution to children and things like that. And that was essentially the way most U.S. attorneys' offices were already acting. It's the way most U.S. attorneys are acting still since the rescinding those memoranda. Now, the reality is that the federal government has never placed a high priority on prosecuting low-level possession and distribution of marijuana, and it doesn't have the resources to do it. And the real effects of marijuana prohibition on legal businesses are the consequences that flow from the underlying prohibition. So John just mentioned the ability to obtain relief under the CARES Act. We've already talked about the way the prohibition interacts with other laws, and those are things the executive branch can't do anything about unilaterally. The executive branch can't just suddenly wave a magic wand and make banking law change or make gun laws change or what have you. Those sorts of things require legislation. The one possible exception is descheduling, but in my own view is that's something that takes time and would be difficult. And as I said, I don't know if John wants to say more about the descheduling route.
Sure. Yeah, the 2020 Democratic primary had some promises about cannabis legalization that were far-fetched to be generous. The president does not have the power to deschedule or legalize cannabis by executive order at any time. On day one or the last day of the presidency. He is forbidden by law from doing that because the Controlled Substances Act sets out a very clear administrative process by which cannabis would be descheduled. One thing that a president could do on day one is appoint an attorney general and an FDA chief and an HHS secretary and a DEA head who are all committed to legalizing or descheduling cannabis. and then that administrative process would play out. It takes time. And if a president is truly committed to this, he can affect that action over time. There are other things that a president can do through enforcement discretion to really put pressure on agencies to treat cannabis businesses in different ways. We haven't seen presidents do that in much of an effective way, President Obama or President Trump, but there are ways outside of Cole memo style enforcement discretion that things can be done to provide some relief. But ultimately, this sits with Congress. Working out the details of this is going to sit with Congress. And the first part of the question was, who do you think of the two presidential candidates would be better on cannabis policy? And to be honest, I don't think either of them will on their own. I've been hearing for 3.5 years that Donald Trump has a secret plan to legalize cannabis. I haven't seen anything happen on that. I don't think he's going to do it in the next 8 months, but who knows? He's an unpredictable guy. I don't think Joe Biden is a particular fan of the idea of cannabis legalization, but I think with Vice President Biden, what you're going to see, you've seen his rhetoric change a little bit. You can call it a flip-flop, you can call it evolution, you can call it disingenuous. There's a lot of things I think you can call it. But what I think it reflects is enormous pressure from the Democratic Party for him to move on this. And I think those conversations about social equity and criminal justice and racial justice and economic opportunity and business freedoms and things like that are going to have their impact. And I think if Joe Biden wants to be a more progressive president than the history of his record, you're going to see those voices like Bernie Sanders, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, like Kamala Harris, like many other mainstream Democrats and progressives really begin to have his ear and say, listen, even if you're not here, this is where the party is and this is where America is. Now, it's not to say that Biden is going to move on that, but I think there are going to be many more voices in a Biden White House to push him in that direction than there have been so far in a Trump White House.
Thank you, John. I've seen a couple questions relating to taxpayers. One of them coming from Facebook is from Smart Approaches to Marijuana, which I'm sure you guys are familiar with, Kevin Sabet's group, who I've debated a couple times. But a lot of people have asked, should taxpayers, many of whom do not vote in favor of marijuana legalization, be forced to subsidize loans or grants to federally illegal businesses? The answer to that is yes, because the same as guns, and that's how democracy works, but we'll see. I mean, if anyone has any comments on that, if there's any difference for SBA loans to marijuana businesses.
Well, I mean, I'll start. I think the question is whether or not we think it's really the place of the federal government to decide whether or not certain products are legal or illegal under applicable state law. And the reality is that in all kinds of other contexts, we allow states to have different rules about what sorts of things are legal or illegal. I remember when I used to live in the DC area, I could have a radar detector in my car in I forget whether it was Maryland or Virginia. One of them allowed them, one of them did not. When I moved here to Ohio, high alcohol content beers were not yet legal in the state. And for purposes of federal law, there was no difference between businesses that were selling the one set of products versus another, so long as they were legal under applicable state law. That's how we treat most of these sorts of questions. And my own view is ideally that's how we would be treating marijuana as well. And if we treated marijuana that way, it would be like guns. It would be like anything else where state laws vary, but the question of availability to things like SBA loans and the like would be a function of operating in conformity with the law of the applicable jurisdiction.
So I'll add quickly. I think that while I think the question is framed poorly, I think there's a serious point within that question to be made. The question isn't whether businesses should be bailed out because some taxpayers disagree with it. As Trevor said, we have a democracy. There's a lot of types of businesses I don't like. I hope they get bailed out, because that's how our system works. And some people are teetotalers and don't like alcohol, and some people are afraid of flying, and the airline industry is getting a check handed to them. And so the idea that simply disagreeing with a policy should mean that money shouldn't flow to help those legal businesses is just anti-democratic. But the question is, should businesses that the federal government have deemed illegal be helped by federal money? And I think that's a critical question. If you start to have businesses, if you start to have states say that a variety of other businesses are legal beyond cannabis, cocaine grows, or coca grows, or cocaine production, or fentanyl production, or things like that. At what point does that stop, and at what point do you draw the line? I think that while that's probably frustrating to a lot of people in the cannabis industry, it just reflects how difficult our current system is. That if a majority of Americans support legal cannabis, and the federal government is letting states have these industries and employ tens of thousands of people, but then an economic crisis hits that system, that they can't be bailed out. But there's both sides to that conversation that really is unresolved, or resolved in a very certain specific direction because of congressional action and currently congressional inaction. And so the frustrations are going to abound. And I think at the end of the day, cannabis businesses probably are not going to get bailed out because members of Congress are looking to spend political capital on a variety of things. And the cannabis industry is not going to be at the top of the list for a lot of people.
Thank you. On this, there's a couple of questions here about the fact that marijuana is Schedule 1 with no medical value. So Richard Rose on Facebook says, how is this still possibly true? So finding the 46 states have found some form of medical value. And so Schedule 1 says no medical value. How is that still constitutional? And how can we leverage that? I don't know if maybe John Hudak would be the best person to take that one.
I think what we've seen in the past couple of weeks is actually a really interesting example of the challenge here. I don't think public opinion should dictate what is medicine and is not medicine, or what medical treatment is and what it's not. I get very frustrated watching the presidential briefings from the White House, where the president is telling people to use medicines that the medical community has not said will work, or the medical community has not vetted. I think that's very dangerous to do. Now, I have people in my life who I know I see get medical relief, get some sort of symptomatic relief from cannabis, but that's not how we do business in the United States. We have a rigorous FDA process to say what is medicine and what is not medicine. And so I understand that concern. Now, to then go into states and say, we have to get rid of all of this. We have to get rid of the systems that you have. It's hard to put the genie back in the bottle, but I think one of the worst things we have right now around cannabis are companies making wild and unproven claims about cannabis. And the COVID-19 pandemic is a perfect example. You have companies, you have websites that are saying the use of cannabis is great for the treatment of COVID-19. And that is horrible behavior, absolutely reprehensible behavior. And when those companies and those systems are not getting regulated properly, lives are at stake. And to me, that's an enormous problem with the system that we have currently.
It reminds me, if anyone remembers from law school, the carbolic smoke ball case, where they claimed that you could heal yourself of flu or prevent flu by inhaling the smoke ball. Ilya, you have a follow-up on this?
Yeah, this is a good place to insert the two exceptions to the federal complete ban. One is a research study. The FDA was stingy in the last decade. It's opened it up. I think there's now about 350 research projects, or at least there were at some point in the last decade. Presumably, some of them are finding some medical benefit, so it's a bit of a legal fiction that it's still Schedule 1. But the other exception is kind of a tidbit for your cocktail parties, I suppose, anyone watching this, is the Federal Compassionate Use Program, kind of like the state medical marijuana that was started under President Carter and quickly ended. So it's still grandfathered in. There are currently, I believe, 7 patients remaining. And since there's a federal program, that means there's a federal grow site. And there is a federal grow site of marijuana contracted out to the University of Mississippi. Now, I don't know whether that's because the senators from Mississippi in the late 70s were very powerful or very weak. But anyway, there you go.
And Trevor, if I could just jump in on this for a second, something we need to remember from a administrative law standpoint is that Congress, for good or ill, has delegated authority to consider the evidence on medical uses of marijuana to a federal agency under the various administrative law doctrines we have in place. That means that agency gets to decide how to weigh the various competing claims, how to evaluate the various studies that have been done. And that gets, in the context of judicial review, that gets an extreme amount of deference. In some respects, we even call it a super deference when it comes to a federal agency's evaluation of the relevant scientific studies. So the fact that states disagree with the federal government may matter politically. It may matter in terms of how people feel about the subject and may affect the political debate. But from a legal standpoint, it's not particularly relevant. If the federal agency in question is able to offer a reasoned explanation, that doesn't mean an explanation we agree with, but an explanation that has reasons about why they weigh the scientific evidence in a particular way or reach certain conclusions. Given that that agency's been delegated that power by Congress, that goes. Now we could talk about how might be a better way of handling these sorts of questions, more federalism, less deference to administrative agencies, what have you. But under current law, that's the way it works.
Yeah, and I'd like to add, I've written about this before, where the FDA path is an interesting one that you could pursue, but it's very unlikely, I would say nearly impossible, that the FDA will ever approve full plant marijuana as a having medical uses. It's about as likely as them approving chicken soup. Like the FDA prefers single substance, like, pills in a single substance, and marijuana has so many substances in it that they were unlikely to ever approve that. And on this point, we have a question from Twitter from Republicans Against Marijuana Prohibition, asking about this declassifying or reclassifying cannabis and why it gets all the attention. There's been a method in the Controlled Substances Act to apply and obtain for an exception to federal Schedule 1. Why is that routinely overlooked? Maybe John Hudak has a thought on that.
Well, I think the conversation right now has focused on scheduling because that's where the political conversation is right now. Oddly, to me at least, an administrative process ended up being the right type of avenue by which people could understand a policy issue. And the advocacy community, the pro-cannabis advocacy community, was very effective in the early 2010s, talking about rescheduling as a path toward policy change and explaining that to the public in a specific way. And now as the focus around issues around racial justice and criminal justice have elevated in the policy conversation, the discussions about descheduling have really taken root. And maybe that sounds more technical and less offensive than legalization. But ultimately, what the advocacy community has done, as I said, is found a messaging campaign that has really connected with the American public in a very valuable way. And it's also connected with members of Congress who look at this issue and see it as more of a government action rather than a public action or a public opinion action that maybe they would be more comfortable with moving forward. And so the elevation of descheduling, particularly over the past, I would say, 2 to 3 years in particular has been one that has been masterful by those supporting it, and particularly those supporting criminal justice reform and racial justice issues.
This is an important one. I'm not sure who might have a comment on this, but it's a good question from Dale Geiringer, I think is how you pronounce it, I think from Facebook. Doesn't the Single Convention Treaty on Narcotics, a UN treaty from 61, I think originally, remain a serious obstacle to descheduling? The treaty allows medical use, but not outright legalization. Won't the DOJ and State Department move to block descheduling on these grounds? I don't know who has a comment on that.
I can start. I mean, they might. I mean, it's certainly the Justice Department could feel constrained by that obligation. Of course, Congress would not be. So if Congress were to change the underlying legal treatment of marijuana, that the treaty obligations would not stand in the way of that. I understand, though, in terms of the treaty obligation itself, is that insofar as it allows for medical use, that would constrain perhaps what the outcomes of a descheduling process are, but wouldn't necessarily prohibit it entirely.
And quickly, I'll add to that. Ultimately, a descheduling decision, if it's made administratively, rests with the Attorney General. And so I can't imagine an Attorney General issuing the okay for rulemaking to begin around descheduling, and then also at the same time say, I'm vetoing my own decision because it's violating international treaties. I think from a technical perspective, yes, it would be an explicit violation of the Single Convention. But look to what the UN did to Uruguay. Look to what the UN did to Canada when they decided to violate the Single Convention. Absolutely nothing. And so I think the US can rest assured that if it decides to just ignore the basis of the Single Convention, that A, the UN's not going to do anything about it. Other countries are not going to sanction us as a result. If they didn't sanction Uruguay, they're not going to sanction the United States. And ultimately, an Attorney General is not going to contradict himself or herself.
I'm going to take the last sort of moderator's problem to sort of, we have 3 minutes to go, so each of you can weigh in on moving out of this. What is you think right now? Of course, the pandemic has changed so many things, but even in a regular time, what are the best steps to take if we want to sort of rectify these problems and the contradictions between federal and state law? So I'll start with Jonathan, and then we can go John and then Ilya.
Well, I mean, I would say the first thing you want to do is get up to speed about why federalism is key to understanding this legal landscape. And so, that's a reason to go out and buy the book. You can there's a Kindle version. You can order it through Amazon or straight through bookings. But that aside, I do think that if one wants to solve the Schrodinger's weed problem, as Ilya so aptly put it, you have to reconcile state and federal law. And I think that ultimately requires the federal government focusing on the distinct federal interests in marijuana, which relate to things like trafficking and don't relate to local distribution and use. And the more people can understand that we've done this before, we've done this with alcohol, and it worked out. And by worked out, I don't mean that we have alcohol laws that I like. I mean, it worked out in that we have a federal state system that allows states to determine what occurs locally, and the federal government focuses on the distinct federal interests related to things like interstate commerce, and that works. And allowing that for marijuana through legislative action, I think would solve that as well.
John?
So I think what needs to happen is for Congress to have a very detailed, holistic conversation about what cannabis legalization is going to look like. I think one of the problems, and I mentioned it before in the 2020 Democratic primary, was this conversation around cannabis that just seemed so easy and so simplistic and so just ready to go on day one. And Congress isn't there yet. The incoming administration is not going to be there yet. As I mentioned, and Jonathan's book is a great example of this. This is a complex area of policy that is going to have tremendous consequences for other areas of policy. And simply flipping the switch on day one is going to leave not dozens, but hundreds of policy questions unanswered. And so if Congress and either the current president or the next president is going to want to move forward with legalization, they're going to have to think very deeply about what that system looks like and how the shared powers between the states and the federal government are going to map out.
Ilya?
If we're looking at incremental federal change, then the Safe Banking Act certainly addresses the most immediate need. How these businesses exist, and it's dangerous and problematic in various ways, not to access most of the financial system. And then there's something like the States Act, where the federal government just legislates that if your state has legalized, and for federal purpose, it has legalized as well. Also allowing interstate trade, interstate commerce, proper use of the Commerce Clause among those states that have legalized. Right now, it's very hard to have that kind of interstate commerce. But generally, yeah, I agree with John Hudak. There has to be some sort of global conversation rather than kind of putting your hands over your ears and ignoring the fact that there is this instability in the law and in a growing sector of business.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. That's all the time we have today. Thank you for attending today's event. And there were many questions that came in that I saw, some of which were very good, but maybe more about a different subject. So I apologize that I couldn't get to all of them. The video recording of this event will be available later on the webpage later today. And have a good afternoon.